to a number of other things that you will see, where they say that the Indian traditions of logic, medicine, that means Nyaya, Tarka, astronomy, philosophy, all these have to become part and parcel of our civilizational tradition. This is how they are trying to bring in. In terms of the diaspora diplomacy and the global Indian identity, if you look in, we see the Prime Minister himself going to the Madison Square, the Wembley Stadium in 2015, the Howdy Modi in Houston in 2019. All of these are part and parcel of what we call as the performance or performative assertions of Indian power and also the global confidence itself. This is how India comes back and forth, because in one or the other way, we see uh, we using Indian terms in foreign policy. We also bringing in terms such as Panchamrit in the neighborhood first policy. Number of things that we see, we are trying to root the very language or the narrative in something that we are comparatively comfortable and other things. Along with that, we also have contested identities in the form of Article 370, CAA, NRC, and also the whole secularism debate itself. When we abrogated the Article 370 in 2019, we saw, and many of them, in fact, saw this as a very, very bold act of national integration, which they were unable to do it for a very, very long time. And critics saw this one as some sort of a constitutional overreach that undermined federalism and also the Kashmiri autonomy. But their arguments were absolutely different. They were asking that how is it that within a country, when the constitution so clearly and specifically talks about that, how somebody can have a preferential treatment and how long? That's also a question that they tried posing. Now, a bit controversial component was the Citizenship Act that we saw that came in 2019, the CAA, that provided some sort of fast track Indian citizenship for the persecuted minorities in the neighborhood, but only to the non-Muslims. This is something that got into different type of a problem altogether. We also see the NRC, that is the National Register for Citizens, that also led to wide protests, including the Shaheen Bagh sit-in that also turned into very problematic issue where the Muslim women led it from the front. So number of people, in fact, they started challenging this as some sort of majoritarian turn that we see in the Indian nationalism. And also it also revived debates around constitutional secularism, equality, and the citizenship itself. Now, all said and done, these contestations reflect some sort of ideological fault lines of the Modi era that we see. Is Indian identity to be defined constitutionally or civilizationally? Is secularism a core value or a colonial leftover? Now, each of these have come back and forth, because they also seem to be saying India, that is Bharat. So we will use Bharat. If somebody wants to use India, let it be. That's a colonial part. But we will use the word Bharat because that is part of our civilization. Now, this debate is going on into what we call as the nationalist metamorphosis that we have been seeing. But if you look at the continuities, contradictions, and the challenges itself in the post-colonial nationalism from 47 to 2024, we have number of things that are also part of the continuity, but we also have contradictions. This is a problem because each government at some or the other point of time has attempted to construct what we call as a very coherent sense of nationhood, sheer diversity of India, religious, linguistic, regional, caste-based, all of these things. But at the same time, they've also been contested and evolving project. Now, in the contemporary movement, if you look at homogenizing nationalism, particularly in the majoritarian kind, increasingly comes into tension, which is actually challenging what we call as the deeply plural ethos that India practiced for a very long time. Now, having said that, now when we look at, let's say, each of the components that we spoke so far, I perhaps would want to conclude. If you look in now, as India completes over 75 years of independence, the question of national identity remains not only unresolved, because this national identity is also evolving over a period of time because of ideological differences and the way national leaders have behaved and all these things. But at the same time, it is also increasingly contested and dynamic, from Nehruvian imagination of secular institutionalism to the more recent turn towards cultural nationalism and civilizational confidence that India is showing. India's self-image has evolved through negotiations, assertion, and the resistance also. Both of them are there. There is no doubt about here. Now, the future of Indian identity hinges on a fundamental question at this juncture. Can India remain plural while becoming more civilizationally assured sort of a state, self-assured state? That's a question that will continue to haunt us. The affirmation of India's civilizational roots, seen in recent policies, public discourse, and also international positioning, at no point of time one can doubt that these have brought in cultural pride. But at the same time, whether we see the way yoga is being celebrated globally, or the reconstruction of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, or the incorporation of the Indian knowledge system in new education policy, the Modi era has emphasized that modern India need not be alienated from its ancient past. We need not have the hangover of the colonial times, and we need to decolonize from our homes. However, the challenge also is to ensure that civilizational pride does not actually morph into what we call as cultural exclusivism, because the civilizational model, because it existed with one group of people, but India became much more plural in the later stage. One problem will be, how do we embrace or how do we manage the composite and the syncretic ethos that has defined Indian history so far, whether it is about the Vedic chants or the Sufi music, Jain philosophy or the Buddhist compassion, temple bells or the church choir. All of these have existed together. Now, this also brings us to the second critical reflection. Is Indian identity today more post colonial or neo colonial? Now, that's a very interesting question. Now, in theory, assertion of civilizational nationalism should mark a post colonial awakening. Am I right? Now, what it has to do is that we need not feel inferior, as I gave some of the examples. We need not actually be feeling inferior, and we need to shed what we call as the Western epistemes and also colonial constructs. Some contradictions will remain. Is everything that has come from the West wrong? That's a question that will haunt us. The bureaucratic mindset, legal system, or even the notions of modernity and development somewhere are part of the modern paradigms only, because we continue to work. We need validation from them. That's why we keep citing this is what the World Bank has said, this is what the IMF has said, and all these things. But at the same time, there is this tendency to decolonize the mind. This is what they've been talking about. And we see a number of thinkers, including Ashish Nandi, and a number of them are talking about that there is some sort of a majoritarian revisionism that is happening in our country, renaming cities, revising textbooks, and other things that we are doing. One set of people feel actually that this is the justice that has been done. Another set feels somewhere this is some sort of a democratic reimagining of power, representation on the voice, and especially for the marginalized groups, because they were left out of narratives and other things. But here is a political party that seems to be carrying all these people together, whether it's Dalits, all Adivasis, women, and other religious minorities, except maybe for one or two. This is something that has been happening. Now, this particular reinvention of the Indian identity is not a closed project. One need not worry about it because it's an ongoing process. However dominant, however majoritarian component comes into the electoral process, at the same time, this will also push us to think, because the third term of Modi became comparatively fragile because it had to do a delicate balancing act. So there is possibility that the debate on, let's say, civilizational authenticity and also democratic inclusivity will continue to define India's logical or ideological landscape itself. That's one of the reasons I say that India's identity will not be decided by one leader, party, or an ideology, but it will emerge from what we call as the daily negotiations in classrooms, courts, parliament, social movements, and even WhatsApp groups. They are so powerful these days. Though we make fun of them as WhatsApp universities, and it peddles fake news and other things, but it has also become a very, very important source of mobilizing people. It has also been educating people on number of things. That's one of the reasons where millions of Indians are grappling with what it means to be, or what it means to be belong to a nation which is so ancient, yet so young from the perspective of being a decolonized or a post-colonial state. In that negotiation lies what we call as the promise and the perils of India's future as plural yet confident civilizational state. Now, perhaps I'll stop with this with regard to the first lecture, and then we will move into the second lecture that is assigned to me, which is largely on the post-colonial modernity, that is between tradition and globalization. This is the second theme that perhaps we will be dealing today. In this particular talk, though it is somewhere connected and there might be a little of overlapping, but this largely concentrates on the idea of modernity and also the issues associated with tradition and globalization. Long ago in 1907, in fact, Rabindranath Tagore warned India against blind imitation of the West. Somewhere he felt we admiring the West is okay, embracing certain values that are universal is okay, but blind imitation just because anything comes from there is modern and phenomenon. He said, if we borrow the dress of the West, we shall be more ashamed of our nakedness. The soul of India will disappear in the shadow of Europe. This is what he said. This is perhaps one of the early critique of modernity itself, delivered during the colonial era, something that captures the essence of India's enduring struggle, how to modernize without losing the civilizational self. That's why I said there is a connection between both of these themes in one or the other way. Now it's been more than a century, right? This tension continues to define what is post-colonial modernity in India. Now, when I say post-colonial modernity, though it sounds very fancy and looks like or sounds like a jargon, what it refers to is to the complex condition in which societies that have emerged from the shadow of colonialism that negotiate between twin imperatives of tradition and transformation. We are always worried about this one. We expect our children to be deep rooted in cultural and civilizational values, but we expect them to study things that are modern. So it creates a sort of confusion what to take, what not to take, because we don't spend so much of time. Because it's not merely about adapting Western institutions like the nation state, bureaucracy, or university, but rather it involves created or creative, contested, and often contradictory synthesis between global modern forms with local and also civilizational contents itself. Now, for India, for that matter, modernity has not followed a linear Western path. It has unfolded at different level. This is context that's been shaped by what I call as one, a colonial rule. Second is the civilizational depth. And third, what we call as the social plurality, which is not that deep in the Western society. They're comparatively homogeneous, if not absolutely. They're not as diversified as us. Now, the post colonial Indian state has tried to institutionalize modern values. Let's say we have not stuck ourselves saying that one, we will only be deep rooting ourselves in the Indian tradition. So we have accepted democracy, secularism, scientific rationality, and all these things. But at the same time, we are also stuck at some of the component that includes caste, religion, language, and region. Now, you will yourself remember, those of you who are from Bangalore and elsewhere, of late how language has been playing a very important role. How everything gets into some sort of a politics. That's a case with Tamil Nadu. That's a case with many others. That's a case with northern India. That's a case with Mumbai, where MNS goes on ransacking and then fighting out people, saying that if you're in my state, you need to speak that language. So somewhere some of these things are also very problematic, because this particular duality makes India itself as a compelling case of what we call as the hybrid modernity. That's a terminology that I'm using here. It's called as the hybrid modernity. Now, there are three fundamental questions around which perhaps I would frame the whole of my talk itself on the Indian post-colonial modernity. How has India navigated modernity after colonialism? What have we done? On one hand, I mentioned Nehru's scientific temper and planned development to Modi's vision of a civilizationally confident new India. Now, both are different one. Whereas Nehru also said that we have got a legacy from the civilization. He was not asking for a revival. But here we see in 2024 and 25 that we are living now, we see a leader who's asking us that we need to be civilizationally confident. We are a new India. We should not fear anyone. So Indian modernity itself has oscillated between imitation and innovation, institutional rationality, and also cultural symbolism. So the institutional rationality is that we have a parliament, but that parliament is culturally rooted. That's why Sengol goes from Tamil Nadu. So Nehru's India built dams, IITs, and steel plants as temples in modern India. Gandhi, by contrast, actually his own teacher, saw modernity as dehumanizing and also actually proposed what we call as the civilization of morality rooted in Swaraj. This was one major contest that happened between the teacher and the student. Gandhi wanted to build, small canals, dams, and such other things, smaller ones. Nehru wanted big dams to be built. Gandhi spoke about cottage industries, small scale industries. Nehru was interested in public sector units, which were huge, and he wanted to provide employment. Gandhi was against, language-based states, linguistic-based states. Nehru went ahead with linguistic-based states. So, a number of things that Gandhi thought were negative and one should not indulge. Unfortunately, his student indulged in the same things only. So, there were these competing visions that continued to shape. Maybe, we don't know. Gandhi got killed in 1948. Had he survived maybe another 10 years, how he would have worked on the conscience? How actually Nehru would have been very, very careful in the presence of someone like M.K. Gandhi or Mahatma Gandhi. The second question is Indian modernity Western, indigenous, hybrid, or globalized? This is the second question that I'm asking here. Now, Indian modernity resists a singular classification. That's one of the first problems. It is Western in its embrace of parliamentary democracy, English education for that matter. In fact, if at all there is something that is uniting this country together at this juncture and there is some sort of an interaction that's happening in English. And this language is not even indigenous. Government of India is also sending circulars and everything on civilization, on indigenous, on Indian knowledge system in English. Though they are also sending it in Hindi, this is the thing. Now we have as components of it, we have parliamentary democracy, we have English education, we have also embraced capitalism. Since when capitalism was in India? But we have accepted it. We have thought this is okay. Now it is indigenous in its reassertion of what we call it the Hindu and the Indic tradition, no doubt about it, visible in everything from temple architecture to educational reform. We see somewhere in one or the other way it's coming back and forth. Now it is hybrid in everyday practice where smartphones and Vedic chanting coexist. So you see a Vedic scholar chanting, having a smartphone in front of him because he is having the Vedic hymns in the smartphone itself. Now this is the syncretic that you will see, or you will see this one existing together. You will also see Bollywood films weaving together Mughal romance, nationalist pride, and the global glamour. They will bring all of them. Now, and it's also globalized in the lifestyle aspirations of India's urban middle classes, the influence of the diaspora, and the participation of the global technological and also financial network. So we are also trying to be global, but rooted in what we talk about as very important components here. Now, the third question that I'm trying to answer, which we will also take a little deeper and understand, what role do tradition and globalization play in this whole process itself? That is what I'm concerned in the post-colonial modernity. Now, tradition has not disappeared, but rather it has been reinterpreted. That's what is my acceptance here. Now, the Gita or the Bhagavad Gita is taught as a management manual. Ayurveda is marketed as wellness therapy. Festivals have actually become spiritual and commercial events. Kapilji, you are saying something? Mr. Kapil Kamble?
ఇప్పుడు ಒಬ್ಬೊಬ್ಬರ ನಾಳೆಲ್ಲ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಕೇಳ್ತಾರ
Mr. Kapil.
ಒಂದೊಂದ್ ಸುಮ್ ಇರ್ತಾವ ಕ್ಯಾಮ್ರಾ ಕಂಪಲ್ಸರಿ ಆನ್ ಮಾಡಕ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರ ಮೊಬೈಲ್ ಮುಖ ಕಾಣ್ಬೇಕಾದ್ರ ಭಜನ ಆಡವ್ರ ಕೇಳವ್ರ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳವ್ರ
He doesn't even know that the mic is on and he's speaking.
Sir, you please go ahead, sir.
But he'll keep talking in between. He'll disturb, no?
That MMTC should, we should ask MMTC to mute him, sir.
Now he has done by himself. I think he realized. that his mic was on. These are the disasters of being
Yes.
on online mode.
No, I'm muted, sir. From MMTTC only muted, sir.
No, fine, ma'am. Mr. Kapil was speaking, and somebody was
Yes, yes,
suggesting to
yes.
him
I
that they
thought,
have.
sir, he's asking some question.
No, that's fine. No issues.
Okay, sir.
So I was just mentioning that the Bhagavad Gita is taught as a management manual. In fact, number of them keep telling that there is no better one, and it's been taught in most of the IAMs. Ayurveda has been marketed as a wellness therapy these days. It's a fashion to even do yoga. The type of products that get sold, what you wear, what the mats that you use, and the place that you use, it's almost become a lifestyle now. Festivals have become both spiritual and commercial events, the type of things that we use. Meanwhile, globalization has also amplified both aspirations and anxiety because creating a middle class that wears Levi's and also worships Lakshmi. This codes or that particular thing is, the Silicon Valley that you will see, number of people living as Indians there, but they have become much more Indian and they are much more deeply civilizationally rooted than that of the people who are in India itself, though they have gone to other states. Now, but all these things are part of modernity, but we will vote based on caste line. So caste becomes a primordial factor in our voting pattern. Now, this is a very, very serious issue that we need to talk about when we are talking about post-colonial modernity, which is stuck at some point of time. Now, in the essence, post-colonial modernity in India is not a destination, but a very dynamic negotiation between memory and aspiration, rootedness and reinvention. It is within this space of tension that the Indian identity somewhere continues to evolve itself. Now, if you look at post-colonial modernity in India, which is between tradition and globalization, if we must actually begin with the global discourse on modernity itself, to examine how Indian and post-colonial thinkers have actually engaged in, because our concern here is not about how others have looked at, but largely at how post-colonial thinkers have been looking at it. Now, this theoretical component that we are talking about here is trying to understand India's journey from colony to a nation state and from tradition to a techno global ambition that we are showing. As of now, we are a technical giant. There is no doubt about it. Number of people whom we are producing as techies itself is running the world. From the top CEOs in the world who are in technology are Indians. That's the sort of scenario that we're living in. Now, if you look at modernity is not come to or has not come to India in isolation, but rather it's a global project. You might have heard of some names, very famous names of scholars such as Charles Taylor, Marshall Bremen, and you also have Anthony Giddens. These people define modernity as a comprehensive transformation that affects not just economies and institutions, but also identities and the worldview. As we become more and more modern and more wealth and more embracing of the global culture, our visions also keep changing. Our own horizon also keeps changing. Now, according to Charles Taylor, if you look in, he says that modernity involves the rise of individualism, instrumental reason, and secular time. What he simply says is displacing all these three are doing what we call as the displacing traditional cosmologies. This is what he says. Now, Marshall Berman, in all that is, his work actually that is called as All That Is Solid Melts into Air, he views this whole thought of modernity itself as both liberating and disorienting. He sees modernity as both liberating and disorienting with paradoxes. He says progress and alienation. Now, progress is that we have become techies, we are earning massive amount of money, but the person says, I don't even have anybody to talk to me, I'm into depression. Freedom and fragmentation. With freedom, we thought we will feel liberated, but unfortunately, it has led to fragmentation and we are fighting to assert our own identities. Whereas the third scholar, whom I mentioned, Anthony Giddens, he says that, or he emphasizes on reflexivity, and also disembedding. This is what he talks about. He says where social relations become increasingly abstract and detached from local context. In this particular view of him, he says that modernity is a universalizing force. There is no doubt about it. often associated with Western norms like rationality, science, and capitalism. But however, these global definitions fail to explain how non-Western societies like India experience and reinterpret modernity in their own terms. We can understand that on what pillars the Western civilizations are built or Western societies are built. How do we explain with regard to India? Now, if you look at the post-colonial critics of modernity itself, it's a very interesting component that we see. Post-colonial theorists actually challenge the idea of modernity is as monolithic or Western in origin. They say this very word called modernity is an imposition. How do we call something as modern? Do we call that people who knew extraordinary architecture in the past, like that of, let's say, the Brideshwara temple or the Hoysalas and all these people who knew technology of building certain things that existed for thousands of years as structures, they have not collapsed, even after massive amount of calamities. Do we call them as modern, or do we call ourselves as modern who have been writing Raju loves so and so, this one loves so and so on the temples or on the walls of some of these phenomenal monuments? Whom do we call as modern? Modern because we live in times of modernity, or whatever we call as them, and in terms of the quote unquote, let's say, globalization with technology? We just don't know, because this might be something that has been pushed on us, that whatever West goes through, or whatever Europe goes through, or whatever US or Europe thinks is the real world order. That's a problem here. I mentioned one scholar, Dipesh Chakravarti. He says in his work Provincializing Europe, he argues that European modernity cannot serve as a universal template. Whatever Europe considered as modern cannot be a universal template, because in number of things, the Europeans are actually backward. For example, the Americans gave right for women to vote in 1920. The Swiss people, or Switzerland, which is almost an embodiment of modernity because they practice almost something like a direct democracy, actually gave right to vote for women in the late 70s, 1970s. So which way we call the European modernity as an universal template? How are they imposing on us? So he calls for recognizing subaltern past, and also the epistemology is rooted in the non-Western tradition. So he says post-colonial societies like India live in a heterotemporal zones. He uses a terminology, heterotemporal zones, mentioning simultaneously modern and pre-modern. Both exist together. Another favorite scholar of mine in post-colonial thought is Partha Chatterjee. He critiques what he terms as derivative nationalism, a form of modernity where colonized elites copy Western models, such as the liberal democratic state, without adapting them into indigenous contexts. In his work, The Nation and its Fragments, he mentions, or he distinguishes between outer domain of the Western institutions and the inner domain of the national culture. Both are mentioned by him, where true resistance and self-definitions take place. Thus, essentially defining Indian modernity must be understood not just through Western categories, but also through vernacular, cultural, and spiritual frameworks. This is what Partha Chatterjee talks about. Now, if you look at a lot of Indian thinkers and the competing modernities, India's own thinkers have divergent vision about modernity. Now, Gandhi saw modernity as morally corrosive. This is a term that he uses. He called it as corrosive, linked to industrial violence, greed, and loss of self-sufficiency. Somewhere, the modernity that the Europe pushes makes you selfish. It also pushes you to become greedy. That means it asks you to accumulate wealth beyond your requirement. It asks you to have money beyond your requirement. And it also never tells you this is unethical. Consumption of or wasting food, unnecessarily using fuel, unnecessarily using cars where there's a possibility to use, modern vehicles and all these things. At no point of time it ever says that this is enough or this is unethical, but rather it only pushes them to become part and parcel of the greed, and it also promotes violence and and even legitimizes violence at some point of time. Now, in Hind Swaraj, which I quoted in the previous lecture as well, he critiqued modern civilization as soulless. He uses the word soulless and advocated a return to the village-based ethical living. Whereas another scholar who was equally profound in his understanding of the Indian society and was also in contradiction with Gandhi on many things, that was Dr. Ambedkar. He says, by embracing modernity, he says, but it is rooted in constitutionalism, rationalism, and social justice. So for him, the Buddhist ethics and legal modernity could together dismantle caste oppression. So his project is different here. His idea of the modernity is that something that leaves longer time with an openness to adapt to that particular society, where you can bring in newer ideas and also get rid of something that has been there for a very long time in the name of either culture, in the name of civilizational practices or anything of that sort. So for him, it was absolutely a different project altogether. So, but we also have someone like Nehru, who was influenced so much by the Fabian socialism that was taught to him by his teacher Lasky, and the Enlightenment ideas that he got actually while being in Europe and being educated in Europe promoted the other side of the story in modernity that is associated with scientific temper, centralized planning, and also industrial progress. He had an absolute opposite view than Gandhi by thinking the industrial progress will not push us backwards and make us greedy, but rather it allows us to have enough wealth. This is his idea. For him, modernity meant rational governance and technological advancement. This is very interesting, but within a secular and democratic framework, not outside that one, but all said and done. For him, he wanted rational governance, scientific temper, but technological advancement as well, and that was modernity for him. Now, is one of the other questions that comes into us is, do we have this as a false binary, tradition versus modernity? This is a very interesting question. Number of scholars have actually pushed that tradition versus modernity. Is that really there? Is the question. Because at the heart of India's post-colonial experience lies what we call as the enduring tradition modernity debate. There is no doubt about it. But is modernity inherently opposed to tradition? Why can't we have, and why can't they both exist together? Can both co-evolve and mutually enrich one another? That's a question that we all have to answer. In reality, if you look in, Indian modernity has rarely functioned in binary terms. Tradition has always been reinterpreted in modern forms. That's why we have seen yoga in urban wellness. How many people in the villages perform yoga? You really don't see. It is the urban space that is performing something that is part of a civilizational value, and it has been seen as being there for thousands of years. Sanskrit in digital apps. We also see these days everything is on digital platforms. Or the Ayurveda products and Ayurveda itself in global markets. Global health market has been flooded with Ayurveda products. Now, likewise, modern technology is used to preserve tradition. Temples run online darshan portals. Somebody showing you book your darshan online. You do your arti online. You visit your temple online. You pay online. You scan and pay to the temple. You pay for an annadan through digital mode. Everything we are doing. Ancient manuscripts are also being digitized. So that's a possibility that we are looking at. So Indian modernity is best viewed as layered and hybrid here, where global forms encounter local meanings and tradition is not discarded but also adopted to new realities. Now, this theoretical framework that we're talking about sets the stage for understanding how these ideas unfold historically and also culturally in Indian post-colonial journey itself. Let's come and understand what we call as the legacies of colonial modernity here. Now, post-colonial modernity, when we say between tradition and globalization, is a very interesting component because India's experience from colonialism itself was not merely an economic or political domination, but it's also imposed. It also imposed what we call as a particular modernist worldview. This is what they were trying to say. complete with institutions, language, and values that fundamentally reshaped Indian society. That's why I think the British stayed much longer, because they were in a position to affect Indian society. That's what I feel. Now, the British colonial project claimed to bring what we call as civilization to India itself. And in doing so, introduced modern bureaucratic structures, legal systems, educational institutions, and also what we call as the infrastructural networks. Now, these changes, while disruptive and also deeply implicating the logic of imperial control, also became what we call as the bedrock of India's post-colonial state building itself. Now, these legacies of colonial modernity thus remain of what we call as the paradoxical inheritance, marked both by continuity as well as resistance itself. There is also a colonial constitutional legacy or institutional legacy that we can talk about, where bureaucracy, law, education, and railways, these are essentially part of what we call as the constitutional or colonial institutional legacy. That's what perhaps we can think about. Now, the colonial rule in India institutionalized what we call as the centralized hierarchical bureaucracy, like that of Max Weber, who wanted it to be functional bureaucracy, but it ended up becoming a watertight bureaucracy, which was designed primarily for surveillance, tax collection, and control rather than public service. Initially, the public service was never meant to be even a concept itself. So we had the ICS, or the Indian Civil Service, referred to as the steel frame of the Raj, or the British Raj itself, was admired for its efficiency in order, but was also deeply elitist and racialized. Now, post independence, if you look in, this colonial institution was not dismantled, but rather retained and rebranded. We did not leave out ICS, Indian Civil Service. So we rebranded and we started calling it as Indian Administrative Service. Now it has almost become a backbone, and it's also a dream of most of the Indian students. If you ask anyone, what do you want to become or what do you want to embrace, they say civil service. This is how it happens. Now, despite efforts to democratize it through reservation and wider recruitment, the bureaucratic culture hasn't changed much, and it continues to show colonial attitudes of top-down control, distance from the masses, and also procedural opacity. How many of you can meet a district collector in public space? You cannot. Or a district deputy commissioner in India, in Karnataka's language, they're called deputy commissioners. How many of you can just meet like that? They almost feel like modern princes. The deputy commissioners almost feel that they have fallen from above and they have done something phenomenal, least understanding that they are there for people only. But unfortunate part, but this is the way they are. The legacy of bureaucratic centralism still shapes governance, particularly in rural areas where Sarkar, or the government, is viewed not as participatory state, but also as a distant and a coercive authority. People still fear them. Now, similarly, the legal system, if you look at, also followed the Indian Penal Code of 1860, designed by whom we call as the Thomas Babington Macaulay. It remains largely intact even today. Laws on sedition, obscenity, public order, all of these things will be in one or the other way continuing to do that one. Though we have brought in Bharati Nyaya Samhita and all that thing, but these are also reflections that have again come in a different form. That's all. We might have an Indian name to it, but a lot of things haven't changed. For instance, let's say section 124A on sedition that was used by the British against Gandhi and Tilak have been controversially invoked in even the 21st century. Till recently, these were all used against student activists and also opposition voices. In irrespective of the government, all governments have used this one. Now, in education, colonialism has institutionalized what we call as the English language learning and Western curricula. In your own classes, you will say perhaps the one who is able to speak better English as an intelligent student. Now, all of us have this as a problem. We think that they're very intelligent, they're very smart people who can speak in good English. Now, with the intent of producing what we call as a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, right? This is what exactly Macaulay said in his 1835 Minute on Indian Education. This is what he said. He wanted a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. This is what he said. In post 1947, India has retained this particular system only, with English continuing as a language of power, administration, and upward mobility. Number of us have this opinion. That's why I've been telling my students that if you want to learn English, you should think in English. But most of the students end up thinking in Kannada or thinking in their mother tongue and then try to speak in English. And then subsequently having this opinion that their mother tongue is problematic. But the truth is, your mother tongue is not problematic. I tell them, your mother tongue is grammatically sound. It is English that's funny. English is a funny language. English has lot of confusions. It creates confusion. It says children, S-U-J-R, J-A-R, should not be pronounced as sugar. It has to be pronounced as sugar. In another occasion, there will be SU, and this will insist that you need to pronounce that sum. Like let's say sumoto. Right? There, it says, or you can take any example for the matter. Somebody may say that's a Latin word, or that's some other legal word, or let's say that's a French word, or whatever that is. In number of other occasions, the same logic of SU doesn't go with shoe, but rather it goes with su only. So this creates confusion in children's mind, and we perhaps should be telling them that English is not superior and English is actually a funny language. That's exactly what we are expected to convey here. So we have this idea of the language of power, administration, and upward mobility. Now, institutions like the IITs and the IIMs, through post-colonial creations, operate within the framework shaped by Euro-American scientific and managerial rationalities, rarely integrating indigenous knowledge system into the core curriculum. In all IIMs, they are taught Harvard, business schools or Harvard case studies, because all management schools actually are run through case studies. 80 to 85 or even 90% of their curriculum is through case studies. So they all teach those, but rather they have never looked at how a civilization has been able to manage through the Indian knowledge system, how it has sustained, how it has managed, how it has been as a nation like this. But lastly, if you look at colonialism, has also left behind what we call as the transformative physical legacy in the form of railways, telegraphs, and also what we call as the postal system. Now, initially designed to aid military logistics and commercial exploitation, ironically, over a period of time, what we have seen is that it has ended up becoming arteries of national unity and also development in India. Now, Indian Railways, for that matter, one of the largest in the world itself, remains not just as a transport system, but also a symbol of post-colonial modernity. We don't have a problem with railways. We love it. And we also think that it is one of the most efficient way of traveling in the country. Even while operating within colonial spatial hierarchies that often neglected the needs of the marginalized communities. And it was made as a possibility, though in the initial stage, not everyone was allowed to be where they want to within the railways as well, but over a period of time that's been taken care of. Now, in the previous session, I also mentioned about the concept of inferiority. Here also, this is very important because of the internalization of the Western norms operate through three components. One is called language, second is reason, and third is inferiority. Now, beyond institutions, colonialism engendered what we call as a deep epistemic shift, that is an internalization of Western norms, categories, and hierarchies. The English language, while enabling global mobility and cosmopolitan for urban Indians, my teacher used to say, we live in an Anglosphere. Anglosphere meaning we have New Zealand, we have Australia, we have India, in all these places. Now, these are called as part of the Anglosphere that the British we have a connection with the West. This is what they were talking about, more specifically with UK and also the United States, which speak English. It has actually become, on the one hand, it is serving a certain particular purpose, but it's also become a marker of class and cultural capital, creating a divide between the English-speaking elites and the vernacular population itself. Now, in contemporary India, if you look in English medium schools are aspirational symbols. Everybody wants to, but the class one, they would want to take them to a Montessori where they're going to stand for hours together just to give an interview. And everybody dreams to have their children in the ICS or, some of the elitist schools that only teach in English, and they only see the regional languages are very, very backward and also limiting, unfortunate. Now, the spread of scientific rationalism, which we spoke in the previous time also, Unfortunately, the colonial modernity also came with some sort of a dismissal of the traditional Indian knowledge system. They never thought that we had anything, whether it's Ayurveda, Sanskrit, grammar of Panini, temple architecture, Vedic cosmology, or Varahamira's whole, thought on physics to everything that we are talking about. Somewhere they felt that these have nothing to do with, and they also many occasions denigrated them as unscientific or even called them as obsolete. You guys are crazy. There is nothing like that exists. That's a very unfortunate part. So while post-colonial India has attempted to revive interest in such systems, particularly under the new education policy of 2020, they still face some challenges in being institutionally validated because not everybody is well articulative and well educated in what exactly is Indian knowledge system and what is not. What is superstition and what is knowledge? So, unfortunately, because of these issues, we see them being very, very problematic here. Now, colonial education also generated what we call as the institutional or a civilizational inferiority complex, if I have to put it in those ways, among the Indian elites, because the British narratives of the Indian backwardness, caste oppression, child marriage, these were all internalized and reproduced by the Indians themselves whenever these people spoke about, sometimes without even a critical engagement. Reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Jyotirao Phule, Jyotirao Phule took up these issues, but often in terms of framed by Western liberalism rather than indigenous ethical frameworks. That could have been said in other way as well. Now, even today, debates on modern values versus traditional customs often unwittingly operate within what we call as the Western moral binaries. We put them only as a prism to understand Indian society. Now, the result is a society that in many cases reverses what we call as the Western institutions, habits, and also appearance while struggling to locate dignity with its own cultural moorings. Now, this is also evident in the continuing fascination for foreign degree, Euro-American beauty standards, and also Western consumer brands, despite political rhetoric of what we call as Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, and all that we are talking about. But in all said and done, this is the reality. If I am introduced as Dr. Nanda Kishor from University of Hyderabad, MA, MPhil, PhD, you all feel okay, chalta hai, and a big deal about it. I studied in JNU, I studied in Mysore University, I studied in Tumkur University, I studied in some other university. But then if they go one step further and then tell that Dr. Nandkishore also has done his postdoc from the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, suddenly people, oh, he might be a good scholar. Then they say he is also a DART fellow from Germany. Then they say he's an IVLP from the United States. Then if they say he's an Erasmus Mundus fellow from the European Union, suddenly people start feeling that this fellow might be a great intellectual or he must be a really intelligent guy. So our prism of accepting somebody as a scholar or somebody as intelligent also has something to do with our fetish with American degrees or let's say degrees from the Western countries. And also all for every brand, we have a comparison with the West, which is also very, very unfortunate. Now, post-colonial adoption of the colonial institutions, if you look in, independent India's founding leaders actually made a very strategic decision to retain key colonial institutions, maybe civil service, judiciary, army, police, paramilitary system. All of these are from them only. Where there is, because we felt at that point of time, or we gave a rationale that we need stability, we need order, we need development. But this essentially led to what we see as pragmatic continuity, no doubt about it, but with contradictions. We came up with our own constitution. We did not take up the British constitution and we copy pasted, but rather we put all the effort to do that one. But there was a possibility for us to reinvent and also come up with our own institutions, come up with our own regulations, come up with our own ways of looking at even an Indian penal code. But unfortunately, we did not do that one. For instance, Nehru's embrace of centralized planning through the Planning Commission, for that matter, was borrowed from the Soviet model, but was facilitated by the colonial legacy of the administrative control. That means the ICS, which ended up becoming IAS, was doing, that was from Europe, was doing something to do with the Soviet model. Likewise, parliamentary democracy was instituted without widespread literacy or civic education, relying heavily on what we call as the colonial era political infrastructure that had excluded the masses itself. On the one hand, this continuity enabled what we call as the smooth political transition, there is no doubt about it, preserved administrative coherence, and allowed India to avoid what we call as the military coup and also instability that plagued many post-colonial states, because number of post-colonial states in Africa, even today, they have not overcome the problem, because the moment the colonizers left, they fell into a trap. They actually got into trouble where they tried to do everything by themselves, where they did not have capacity. This is a problem. Because on the one hand, we can also argue that it led to institutional stagnation, a bureaucratic culture hostile to innovation, and an over dependence on the colonial rule books without looking at indigenous experiences. That might be one of the negatives, but at the same time, it also provided an amount of stability, because not all post-colonial reforms failed. If you look at the Indian Constitution drafted under the chairmanship of Dr. Ambedkar, was a radical rupture with colonial legal codes. It enshrined universal adult franchise, affirmative action, fundamental rights. It even brought in what we call as the fundamental duties as well, and then subsequently the DPSP also, directive principles of state policy. It had so many things, and that perhaps was not imagined by the British themselves. But at the same time, colonial style of policing and the judiciary that is always stuck in procedural delays was also an outcome of what we see as the post-colonial modernity. Now, the contradiction is also very clearly visible in Indian engagement with secularism itself, where the colonial state actually controlled a lot of these things. It's some sort of a burden and resource of colonial modernity that we see here. The Indian state education system, legal apparatus, cultural values, all these are part and parcel of that one. That is a problem that we are seeing here. In the previous section, we spoke about Nehruvian modernity, building rational and inclusive nation, where he wanted 5-year plans, planning commission, IITs, aims, public sector undertakings, and all that thing, because the dams, Bhilai, Durgapur, Rourkela, all these became laboratories for modernity. And at the same time, he also had, sought a place for reason above religion, technology above tradition, national interest above parochial loyalties. All these things were spoken about. But at the same time, there were also limitations. It often ignored what we call as, or underestimated, the emotional power of religion or cultural memory itself. Religion is all not so negative. It also has a healing power. It also has controlled society to a very large extent. It has also provided solace when people have actually failed. It has helped them in a different way. But treating the whole of religion itself as irrational remnants is also a very dangerous trend, and that happened during the Nehruvian era. Now, this gap between elite modernism and popular sentiments opened space for alternate models of nationalism itself. Now, if you look at Ambedkar's vision of colonialism, where civic order for justice and equality, you find all this that I spoke before, including that of adult franchise, fundamental rights, reservation policies, affirmative actions that we are talking about to correct historical justice. This is absolutely modern in nature itself, because he was deeply critical of the Hindu orthodoxy and the caste system, there's no doubt. But he also someone who eventually converted into Buddhism in 56, was not just very spiritual move, but also a political statement that he was making, an act of modernity, or modern act for that matter, reclaiming dignity through non-Brahminical, rational spirituality. Now, for Ambedkar, the modern Indian state must be rooted only in technological progress, not only in technological progress, sorry, but also in ethical and social transformation. This is what he was telling. What you will do with only technology? But you are still parochial. You are using technology also to divide people. There's no meaning in that one. Now, Nehru prioritized economic development. Ambedkar prioritized social democracy. But both of them together laid foundational principles of what we call as what we can perhaps call as Indian post-colonial civic modernity. That is what we can talk about. Now, epics, festivals, and national identity, if you look in, we have texts like Ramayana, Mahabharata, and all these things. And we had the serialization of all these things in Ramayana in 87 to 88. Mahabharata from 88 to 90, everybody was glued to this one. And it was also almost considered as some sort of a national cultural moment. Now, this came in irrespective of the language and other things, it was able to bring people together. Festivals like Diwali, Holi, Independence Day, Republic Day, all these also have some sort of cultural rootedness and patriotic pride, often with rituals adapted by even to state symbolism, flag hoisting, parades, patriotic songs, and everything. Now, the other component is also Sanskrit and temples as civilizational anchors. We will continue to see them where some sort of, even for that matter, let's say, what's our motto as a nation? If you look in, it's called Satyameva Jayate, truth alone triumphs, and Yogakshemam Bahamyaham. I ensure that well-being of my devotees. These were the texts that came in one or the other way to influence us. That's why in the beginning itself, there were tensions with regard to this post-colonial modernity, when someone like Babu Rajendra Prasad, Patel, Tundon, and all those people got involved with regard to the Somnath temple's reconstruction in the early 90s, Nehru opposed it. He thought this was a big issue, that how can Rajendra Prasad, being a president, could walk up like this. So he had this absolute negative view of religion, forgetting about the type of things that it had done in the society itself. Now, even recently, we have had this controversies and other things that are associated with Bharat Mata iconography and all that thing, while in the post-colonial era, Indian state did not officially adopt Bharat Mata as such. We really don't know whether it's part of the government or not. But her image came in the public art, calendar prints, school textbooks, political rallies, and many other places. But it's not printed by Government of India. Government of India doesn't have anything like that. It did not go behind that one. This is something that we need to keep in mind. The paradox of invention is authenticity and appropriation. The invention of tradition. This is something that has been spoken by a scholar by name Eric Hobsbawm. The reference is essential to the process whereby modern states construct and popularize new traditions to create social cohesion and also legitimacy. What it simply means with regard to India is that ancient practices were selectively revived, reinterpreted, and also institutionalized. I mentioned about Yoga Day, and then we are also architectural style in this style in the post-India independence building, like we have the India Gate. Now we have the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Now, all these things are continued, but at the same time, we are trying to revive certain things of the ancient past that includes Nalanda, Takshashila, as temples of learning, India's ancient learning, often disconnected from their original historical context, but repurposed or re-emerging as soft parts. This is what we are able to see. Now, changing family structure is also another component that post-colonial modernity has influenced. That is in the perspective of urbanization, gender roles, and also marriage practices. So there's this movement to push forward for the rise of nuclear families in metropolitan cities such as Mumbai, Bangalore, Delhi, Hyderabad, and all these things. So from joint nuclear households that have actually impacted a lot of other things, gender roles have also changed. We are looking at dual income household, working mothers, women entrepreneurs, number of things that we are able to see here, and this whole argument on patriarchy to everything, which are also part and parcel of our discussions itself. Even marriage practices, for that matter, have drastically changed, where arranged marriages continue to dominate, especially in smaller towns and conservative communities. Now they are also incorporating modern elements. That means we have the whole meet and talk pre-wedding shoot before deciding whether they look at LinkedIn profile, they look at many other things. And also, caste boundaries are also partially selectively navigated. I don't fully claim that we have overcome that one. I think all modernity comes and stops at caste. That's my problem here. But at the same time, I can say very confidently that slowly and steadily we're making some move. We don't know how long we will be able to succeed, because initially we thought matrimonial sites will work to blur these human created boundaries, but unfortunately now they have also become a space for layered subjugation or layered imposition of caste identities. That's a problem. Like, let's say, take an example. In 2014, a movie came called Two States, based on Chetan Bhagat's novel, which dramatizes the cultural anxieties of an inter-regional and inter-caste marriage. but it is resolved through some sort of negotiation and also emotional diplomacy that is shown here. Now, consumerism and media, if we look at from the perspective of satellite TV, Bollywood, and also OTTs as hybrid spaces, have also unleashed what we see as post-colonial modernity associated with consumerism, powered by global capital advertising and media representation. Post 1990s, we have seen how a series of channels have come. We have now 24/7 channels, and they are also actually changing or redefining what we see as femininity, morality, and domestic power. We are seeing every day how they are conditioning us. We are looking at the type of serials that come where they are showing women as villains. This is somewhere we will see. But a lady will get up 6 in the morning with her sindoor intact, with ornaments, with an amazing sari and all these things, because sari, sindoor, joint family, all these things are part of the serial only. You really don't see. But this is somehow they show as a negotiation between idealized tradition and practical modernity. This is what we will see. And number of things are, I can give you numerous sort of components, including modern day OTT platforms such as Netflix, Amazon, Hotstar, and all these things. These have revolutionized Indian media, but at the same time, they've also enabled hyper local yet globally accessible content. This is what we are able to see everything. We are also seeing Delhi crime. We are also seeing games, sacred games, to all sorts of things that we are able to see. And even a simple illustration, a movie called Made in Heaven that came in 29, actually talks about lives of wedding planners in Delhi and subtly explores what we call as gender inequality, LGBTQ rights, dowry, social hypocrisy, number of things that they are showing in a different way. That's how fashion, cuisine, youth culture, all of these have changed in India in one or the other form. Now, cultural modernity is also seen as a mirror of post-colonial transition that we need to remember at any given point of time, with the reforms that came in 1990, which are considered, or which is considered as watershed moment, changed a lot of things with regard to India itself, because the new middle class is part and parcel of the post-colonial modernity. They are all into IT firms. They are also part of what we call as the symbol of shining India. We also see them at the same time cultural conservatism that also is brought by them. They continue to cling on to family, caste, marriage, and religion. Number of things that are also happening here. At the same time, we see diaspora and global identity. We celebrate people in the the American Silicon Valley. We see someone like Sundar Pichai heading the Google, Satya Nadella, who also hailed from an institution that I represented before, that's Manipal. Arvind Krishnan is part of IBM. Now we see all these as part of knowledge economy. That's also a contribution that we take pride into. At the same time, we also think that somewhere there's a paradox of growth and inequality that is also existing. We're trying to overcome them in one or the other phase. Somewhere back ago, Ashwini Deshpande actually wrote somewhere in 2011 a very interesting work where seems to be mentioning that upper castes are overrepresented in the formal private sector and also elite universities, despite decades of affirmative actions. This is exactly what she comes in. That means there is a lot more to do. And if you look in, just trying to go forward to conclude so that we have few minutes for discussion, what we need to understand here is that the post-colonial modernity is a confluence of lot of things here. We seem to be seeing that globalization and tradition can actually coexist. The McDonald's has come up with Aloo Tikki Burger, which is an American company. Netflix shows sacred games. Startup entrepreneurs show yoga retreats, or college graduates posting Diwali photos on Instagram, or any of these things. If you look in, these all have one or the other way come in there. Now, are we moving towards decolonial modernities? I'm not really sure about it. In one or the other way, it functions in one or the other place. Movements for curriculum reform, language rights, caste justice, revival of native ecological practices, Indian knowledge in the STEM and AI, that is artificial intelligence, all point towards slow, sometimes fragmented move towards decolonial modernity itself. Yet we must ask this question at the end when I'm concluding: Is decoloniality inclusive or elite? Does it reach the grassroots or remain rhetorical? Can it heal the fractures of caste, gender, and religion, or even region for that matter? Does it risk of becoming a tool of hegemonic civilizational pride? And these questions actually open up a lot of discussions on things such as public dialogue, academic reflection, and also policy experimentation. Just to sum up, Indian modernity or the whole post-colonial modernity is unfinished, plural, and also contested one. Its future will not be found in choosing between tradition and modernity, East and West, or nationalism or globalism. Rather, it lies in transcending these binaries. That means not just juxtaposing each other. It goes beyond that one, crafting a modernity that is ethical, inclusive, rooted, and also open. Now, that's the promise and the challenge that we see in the post-colonial modality, which is truly post-colonial, plural, and decolonial modernity. There is no meaning in having a colonial modernity and feeling ourselves